My name is Ethan Parker. I'm 28 years old, and every time my stepmother called me, my stomach tightened before I even answered. Not because I was happy to hear her voice, not because I missed her, but because I already knew why she was calling. She only called when she needed money. That Friday evening, I was sitting at the tiny kitchen table in my apartment in Columbus, Ohio, eating takeout noodles straight from the carton. My place wasn't much, just one bedroom, old brown carpet, and a fridge that made a strange humming sound all night. But it was mine. I had worked hard for that little apartment. Harder than most people knew. My phone started vibrating on the table. I looked down, and there it was. Linda. I froze with my fork halfway to my mouth. For a second, I just stared at her name on the screen and felt that old, familiar heaviness settle in my chest. Linda Parker. My stepmother. The woman who had lived in my house for almost 17 years and still somehow never felt like family. The phone kept buzzing. I knew I could ignore it. I was an adult now. I lived alone, paid my own rent, worked full-time as a delivery supervisor for a furniture company, and no one could force me to answer a call I didn't want to take. But some habits don't die easily, especially the ones built in childhood. I set my fork down and leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. Just seeing her name brought back the same feeling I used to get as a kid when I heard her heels clicking down the hallway toward my room. That feeling that I had done something wrong, even when I hadn't. That feeling that I needed to be careful, quiet, useful. I was 9 years old when my mother died. She got sick fast, too fast for me to understand. One year she was brushing my hair back with her warm hand when I had the flu, and the next year she was gone. I remember the hospital smell more than anything. I remember the way my father cried in the parking lot because he didn't want me to see him do it. For a while, it was just me and Dad. He wasn't perfect, but he tried. He burned grilled cheese sandwiches, forgot laundry in this washer for 2 days, and packed me the same turkey sandwich for school lunch almost every day. But he was there. He sat through my little league games, even when I spent most of the time on the bench. He helped me with spelling words at the kitchen table. He tucked me in at night, awkwardly pulling the blanket up to my chin like he wasn't sure if he was doing it right. Then, when I was 11, he married Linda. I still remember the first time I met her. She wore a soft pink sweater, smelled like expensive perfume, and smiled at me with lips that looked warm but eyes that didn't. She brought me a remote control car as a gift and asked if I was excited to have a new mom figure in my life. I wanted to be excited. I wanted so badly to believe that maybe life was finally getting easier. Maybe this woman would care if I had a fever. Maybe she'd come to my school Christmas concert. Maybe she'd ask me what kind of birthday cake I wanted instead of buying whatever was on sale. But Linda never became that person. She was never the kind of cruel that left bruises people could point at. Her cruelty was quieter than that, smarter. It was the way she smiled at my father and said, "Ethan's just having a hard time adjusting," after she had spent all morning telling me I was lazy and dramatic. It was the way she bought my little half-sister, Mia, brand new school shoes while telling me mine still looked fine, even with the soles peeling off. It was the way she made me feel like every bite of food I ate, every dollar spent on me, every inch of space I took up in that house was too much. By the time I was 16, I had a part-time job bagging groceries after school. Linda started asking for little favors. Can you help with the electric bill this month? We're short on groceries. Your father's stressed. Don't make things harder. I gave her money because I thought maybe if I helped enough, she would finally see me as something other than a burden. Maybe she'd say thank you and mean it. Maybe she'd tell Dad I was a good kid. But no matter how much I gave, it was never enough to make her kinder. Years passed. I moved out. I built a life. Small, simple, honest. And still, Linda only called when she wanted something. My phone stopped buzzing. Then, a second later, it started again. I looked at her name on the screen and let out a slow breath. Of course she wouldn't give up after one call. I picked up the phone and answered without saying hello. For half a second, there was silence. Then came her voice, soft, sugary, fake. "Ethan, honey," she said. "I hate asking this, but we're in a little trouble right now." I closed my eyes the moment she said it. Of course. There it was, the reason for the call. Not, "How are you?" Not, "It's been a while." Not even a fake question about my life before she got to the point. Just the same old line, dressed in a sweeter voice. Trouble, which usually meant money. I stayed quiet, letting her fill the silence. "Your father's been under a lot of stress," Linda continued, her voice shaky in a way that sounded practiced. "Bills have piled up, and things are just hard right now. I wouldn't ask if it wasn't important." I stared at the noodles getting cold in front of me. "How much?" She answered so fast it was obvious she already had the number ready. 2,000. I let out a small laugh before I could stop myself. Not because it was funny, it wasn't. It was the kind of laugh that comes out when something hurts in a way you've felt too many times before. $2,000. That wasn't grocery money. That wasn't a small emergency. That was almost 2 months of rent for my apartment. That was overtime hours, skipped dinners out, and every extra dollar I'd been trying to save. Linda's voice sharpened. "I know it sounds like a lot, but your father really needs help." I rubbed my forehead. "What happened?" "It's just one thing after another," she said quickly. "The car, the electric bill, the mortgage. We're drowning over here, Ethan." I noticed how she kept saying "we and your father," but never once said "I'm sorry to ask you this." Never once admitted that calling me after months of silence to ask for $2,000 might be unfair. I swallowed hard. I don't have that kind of money to just hand over. The sweetness dropped from her voice so fast it made my jaw tighten. "After everything we've done for you," she said, cold and sharp now, "you can't help your own family?" I stood up so quickly, my chair scraped across the kitchen floor. Family! That word hit something raw inside me. Because the truth was, Linda loved using that word when she wanted something from me. She loved calling me family when there was a bill to pay, a favor to ask, or a problem to solve. But when I was a kid standing in the kitchen with holes in my sneakers, I wasn't family then. When I got the flu and she left a bottle of medicine on my dresser without even checking my temperature, I wasn't family then either. And suddenly, like always, the memories came rushing back. I was 17, standing in the living room with a school paper in my hand. My history class was taking a trip to Washington, D.C. I had been excited for weeks. I had already filled out the form. All I needed was the fee. Linda barely looked up from the TV. "We can't afford that," she said. I remember nodding, trying not to show how disappointed I was. Then, 2 days later, she took Mia to the mall and came home with a brand new pink bike with a white basket on the front. When I asked Dad about it, he looked uncomfortable and said, "It was a special deal." A special deal. That was the thing about growing up in that house. There was always money for something. It just usually wasn't for me. Then I remembered my high school graduation. My mom's older sister had mailed me $300 with a card that said she was proud of me. It was the most money I had ever held in my hands at one time. I had hidden it in a drawer, planning to use it for community college books. A week later, Linda came into my room with tears in her eyes and said they were behind on the water bill. She promised to pay me back in 2 weeks. I never saw that money again. And I was stupid enough to keep believing the next time would be different. At 19, I worked double shifts at a warehouse after dropping out of college because Dad's back injury had gotten worse. I handed Linda almost every extra paycheck for 3 months because she said Dad needed medication and the insurance wasn't covering enough. Later, I found shopping bags in her closet, new clothes with tags still attached. I remember standing there, staring at those bags like they were proof of something I had known for years, but didn't want to say out loud. She had used me. Not once, not twice, over and over again. "Ethan?" Linda snapped, dragging me back to the present. "Are you even listening to me?" "Yes," I said quietly. "I'm listening." "Then act like it," she shot back. "Your father has always been there for you." That one hurt too, because my father had been there for me once. Before life got messy, before he started choosing silence over conflict, before he let Linda become the loudest voice in the house. I looked out the window at the dark parking lot below my apartment. "I need time to think," I said. Linda let out a bitter laugh. "Think? What exactly is there to think about?" I didn't answer. A few seconds later, she hung up on me. I stood in the middle of my kitchen with my phone still in my hand, my heart pounding hard enough to make me feel sick. Then the screen lit up again. This time, it wasn't Linda. It was Mia. Her text was short. "Please don't be mad at Mom. Dad's really sick. She's panicking. I don't know what to do." I read Mia's text 3 times before it fully sank in. Dad's really sick. For a second, everything around me went quiet. The hum of the fridge, the traffic outside my apartment, even the anger still burning in my chest after Linda's call, it all faded behind those 4 words. My father was sick. I typed back right away. "How sick? What happened?" Mia replied almost instantly, like she had been sitting there with her phone in her hand, waiting for me. "He collapsed at work last week. The doctor says his heart is weak and he needs more tests. Mom said not to tell you because she thought it would just upset you." I stared at the screen, my jaw tightening. Not to tell me. Of course. Linda had decided, once again, what I deserved to know and what I didn't. I grabbed my car keys off the counter before I had fully made the decision. 20 minutes later, I was on the highway, heading north toward the small town where I grew up. The one I had spent years trying not to think about. The drive felt longer than I remembered. Maybe because every mile pulled up another memory I didn't want. The gas station where Dad used to buy me a hot chocolate on winter mornings before school. The diner where we ate pancakes after my little league games, back when life was still simple enough for syrup and bacon to fix a bad day. The grocery store where I had bagged groceries after school, saving every dollar while Linda found new ways to spend it. By the time I turned onto my old street, my chest felt tight. The house looked smaller than it had in my memory. The white paint on the porch railing was peeling. The flower beds Linda used to obsess over were dry and overgrown. One of the shutters hung crooked beside the front window. It didn't look like the neat, polished house she had always tried so hard to show the world. It looked tired, like the people inside it. Before I could knock, the front door opened. Mia stood there in leggings and an oversized sweatshirt, her brown hair pulled into a messy bun. She was 20 now, but in that moment, with her eyes red and tired, she looked like the little girl who used to slip cookies into my room when Linda said I'd already eaten enough. "Ethan," she whispered. Then she threw her arms around me. I hugged her back, and something in me softened right away. None of this was Mia's fault. It never had been. "How bad is it?" I asked quietly as we stepped inside. She looked toward the living room and lowered her voice. "Worse than Mom told you." I followed her gaze, and there he was. Dad was lying on the couch under an old gray blanket, his face pale, his shoulders smaller somehow. I had always remembered him as broad and strong, the kind of man who could lift a couch by himself and laugh while doing it. But the man lying there didn't look strong. He looked worn out, fragile. His eyes opened when he heard my footsteps. For a second, he just stared at me like he wasn't sure I was real. Then he tried to sit up too quickly and winced. "Ethan," he said, his voice rough. "You came." I swallowed hard. "Yeah, I came." There was a strange awkwardness in the room, the kind that only exists between people who love each other but have spent too many years not saying the right things. I walked closer, and he reached for my hand. His grip was weaker than I expected. "You should have told me," I said. Dad looked away. "I didn't want to bother you." I almost laughed at that, but there was nothing funny about it. "I'm your son." Before he could answer, Linda appeared in the doorway of the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel like this was any normal evening, and not the first time I had stepped back into this house in almost 4 years. She gave me a tired smile. "I was just making soup." It was such a ridiculous sentence for a moment like that I nearly lost my temper right there. Instead, I looked past her and noticed the stack of unopened envelopes on the kitchen counter. Red stamps, final notices, a shut-off warning from the electric company, a credit card bill folded in half, another from the hospital. The knot in my stomach tightened. Linda followed my eyes and crossed her arms. Things got out of hand faster than I expected. That answer wasn't enough for me. While Dad drifted back to sleep on the couch, Mia touched my arm and led me into the hallway. She closed the bathroom door behind us so no one could hear. "Mom didn't tell you everything," she whispered. I leaned against the wall. Then tell me. Mia took a shaky breath. Dad's been getting worse for months. He kept working because Mom said they couldn't afford for him to stop. But that's not the whole problem. I said nothing. Her eyes filled with tears. Mom has credit card debt, a lot of it. She kept buying things and saying she'd return them or pay it off later. Clothes, furniture, random stuff for the house. She was trying to keep everything looking normal. She didn't want anyone to know we were struggling. I stared at her. And when the bills started piling up? I asked. Mia looked down. She thought she could fix it before you found out. But then Dad collapsed and everything fell apart. I felt something hot and bitter rise in my chest. So this was it. Dad was sick. The money problem was real. But Linda had helped create the disaster, then waited until the walls were closing in before calling me like I was some emergency bank account she could use whenever her life spun out of control. From the living room, I heard Dad cough. And for the first time since walking into that house, I realized this visit wasn't just about money anymore. It was about the truth. And I had a feeling that before the night was over, I was finally going to hear it. That night, after Mia went upstairs and the house finally grew quiet, I sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the pile of bills spread out in front of me. Hospital notices, credit card statements, a mortgage payment that was already 2 months late. The numbers made my head hurt. I had enough money in my savings to help, but not enough to do it without feeling it. That money was supposed to be for my future, for the small house I'd been dreaming about for years. Nothing fancy, just a place with a little backyard, maybe a grill on the porch, maybe a dog someday. A life that felt steady, safe. I looked toward the living room, where Dad was asleep on the couch, and then toward the stairs where Mia's bedroom light still glowed under the door. None of this was their fault. But that didn't erase what Linda had done. I was still sitting there when Dad shuffled into the kitchen around midnight, one hand pressed to his side. He looked exhausted. "You should be in bed," I said, standing up. He gave me a weak smile. "Couldn't sleep." I pulled out a chair for him, and he lowered himself into it with a tired sigh. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere outside, a dog barked down the street. Then Dad looked at the bills and said quietly, "I know I don't have the right to ask you for anything." I turned toward him. He swallowed hard. "But I do have the right to tell you the truth. And I should have done that years ago." Something in his voice made me sit back down. He rubbed a hand over his face. "I saw more than you think, Ethan. I saw the way Linda treated you. I saw the difference. The little things. The big things, too." His eyes filled with shame. And every time I should have stepped in, I told myself I was keeping the peace. I told myself, if I just worked harder, if I just stayed quiet a little longer, things would settle down. He let out a broken breath. "But all I really did was leave you alone in a house where you were supposed to feel safe." I stared at him, and for a second I was 16 again, standing in the kitchen with holes in my sneakers, waiting for someone, anyone, to notice that I was hurting. Dad's voice shook. "The day your mother died, I promised I would never let you feel alone, and I broke that promise over and over again." My throat tightened so fast it hurt. For years I had imagined hearing those words. imagined him finally saying he knew, that he saw me, that I wasn't crazy for feeling unwanted in my own home. And now that it was happening, it didn't feel satisfying. It just felt sad. "I needed you," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Dad nodded, tears sliding down his face. "I know." I looked down at my hands because I couldn't look at him anymore. Do you know what the worst part was? It wasn't even Linda. It was thinking that maybe if my own father could stand there and say nothing, then maybe I really didn't matter that much. He covered his mouth with his hand and cried silently. A minute later, I heard footsteps behind me. Linda was standing in the kitchen doorway in her robe, her face pale. I had no idea how long she had been there or how much she had heard. She looked at Dad, then at me, and crossed her arms like she needed something to hold herself together. "I never asked to be the villain in your life," she said quietly. I stood up so fast, my chair scraped the floor. "You think this is about being a villain? You called me because you needed money, Linda. That's what you always do. You don't call to ask how I'm doing. You don't call on my birthday. You don't call because you care. You call when you want something." Her mouth tightened, but she didn't argue. "You took money from me when I was a kid," I said. "Money I worked for, money I needed. And every time, I told myself maybe this time you'd be grateful. Maybe this time you'd finally treat me like family." Linda looked away. "Well, I'm done doing that," I said. "I'm not your emergency wallet. If I help, it's for Dad and Mia. Not because you suddenly remembered I exist." The words hung in the air between us. For the first time in my life, Linda didn't snap back right away. She just stood there, staring at the floor. When she finally spoke, her voice was smaller than I had ever heard it. "I was jealous of you," she said. I blinked. She let out a shaky breath. "You looked like your mother. You had her eyes, her smile. Even the way Robert talked about you reminded me that part of his heart belonged to someone who came before me. And I was selfish enough to take that hurt out on a child." The room went still. Linda's eyes were wet now, but she didn't try to come closer. "That wasn't your fault," she whispered, "but I made it your burden anyway." I didn't know what to say. It wasn't an apology that fixed everything. It didn't erase years of cold dinners, missing money, and being treated like I was only valuable when I could give something. But for the first time, I understood something I had carried since childhood. Her cruelty had never been proof that I was hard to love. It had only ever been proof that she didn't know how to love me right. The next morning, I made my decision. I paid the hospital bill directly. I covered 1 month of the mortgage and electric bill, and I bought groceries for Mia to keep in the house. But I didn't hand Linda cash. I didn't leave my bank card on the table. I didn't offer more than I could give. A few weeks later, Dad had surgery. It went well. Mia started visiting me in Columbus on weekends, and for the first time, we got to be brother and sister without tension hanging over us. Linda sent short updates about Dad sometimes, nothing more. No sweet fake greetings, no surprise requests for money. And honestly, that was enough. I started looking at small houses again. I kept adding to my savings. I kept building a life that felt like mine. For years, I thought if I kept giving enough, my stepmother would finally love me. But healing didn't begin when she changed. It began when I stopped begging to be chosen by someone who only remembered me when she needed something. And the hardest lesson I ever learned was also the one that finally set me free. You can help people without handing them your whole heart. You can love your family without letting them use you. And sometimes, the moment you stop chasing the love you never truly had is the moment you finally learn how to give it to yourself.